Welcome, dear learners, to week 10. In this week, we are going to talk about Amitav Ghosh, a very important writer of uh, climate change literature. In fact, his book, The Great Derangement, which we have talked about in earlier sections also, uh, it has been the one and only work in India that talks about climate change and literature. So he has raised many climate issues in that book, but he has raised issues in other books as well. So he is known for both his fiction and his non-fiction. So let us get introduced to Amitav Ghosh, a visionary on climate change. He is an influential Indian author whose work seamlessly blends history, politics, and environmental issues, making him a notable figure in contemporary literature. Though he himself belongs to the area of anthropology and he's a visiting professor abroad, he dabbles in several subjects in his novels. His writing spans multiple genres: fiction, non-fiction, essays, and critical commentary. And he's known for the intellectual depth and the ethical concerns related to climate change in his works. So, as I said just now, that in India, I think he is the first voice to talk about the importance of climate change through literature, and that is what we are doing in this course. We are talking about climate change and literature. So the path for this has been set by this visionary Amitav Ghosh. There's a brief biography and a literary journey that we should look at. He was born in 1956 in Calcutta. He grew up in India, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, and all these are reflected in his works. And this upbringing exposed him to diverse cultures, histories, and social challenges. His experiences of growing up in regions affected by political strife and environmental challenges, such as the partition of India and the flood prone Sundarbans region, shaped his deep understanding of the relationship between human societies and nature. Throughout his career, Ghosh has been awarded numerous literary honors, including the Sahitya Academy Award, the Jnanpith Award, and the Padma Shri, which are his key works on climate change. He has written many novels and many non-fiction works, but the ones that focus a lot on climate change issues are The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable, Gun Island, The Hungry Tide, Jungle Nama, A Story of the Sundarban. Each of these works explore different aspects of the climate crisis, drawing attention to its socio-economic, political, and cultural dimensions. So, there is a lot of variety in these books. They talk about different climate issues, and many of them have different environmental settings. He has a knack for history, so he involves us very deeply in history. In many of his novels, he involves us very deeply in the post-colonial situations which are interlinked with climate. So these are sort of indispensable parts or backgrounds of his novels, and at times they are the focus of his novels also. The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable, 2016. In this non-fiction work, Ghosh argues that climate change is one of the most pressing issues of our time, yet it remains vastly underrepresented in contemporary literature. In this work, he goes back to the literature of the 16th and the 17th centuries, and he talks about the Anthropocene, or how human beings are the center of literature, and nature has always been sidelined. So to say, he says that the aim of climate fiction is and should be to remove man from the center and put nature in the center. So when he talks about novels like Moby Dick, or he talks about um, American novels, for example, The Old Man and the Sea, many of these novels uh, show nature that has to be conquered, which shows the victory of human beings against nature. So, nature is a kind of peril and a threat. So, he says this kind of idea should undergo a change, and more work should be done to decenter the human from literature and bring back nature to the center. If we talk even about uh, Anglo-Saxon times, human was always at the center. Whether there was Anglo-Saxon poetry in which there was their protagonist, hero was human, and he was fighting something that was semi-human or non-human, or the fight was against a harsh environment, against the sea. So nature was always in the background, and that followed in later literature also. And so he says that let us decenter human beings and bring nature in the center, decenter the Anthropocene. So the term derangement used in the title of this book reflects humanity's inability to confront climate change on a global scale, as well as the literary world's reluctance to incorporate ecological catastrophes into mainstream literature. Derangement also means a madness uh, that is uncontrollable, the mad dependence on technology, the mad dependence on technology to destroy the environment. So it is a kind of derangement. It is a kind of not a normalcy of the human mind. It is a great derangement because this great madness is going to cost human beings their survival. So, this word here, the great derangement, is very important. And he talks about the importance of literature that would be used as a tool to talk about climate impacts. He calls for new storytelling forms that can grapple with the unthinkable events of climate change, natural disasters, migration crisis, and the environmental degradation, which do not fit neatly within traditional narrative structures. So, right from the 11th century onwards, in the history of English literature, certain traditions have been followed, but he believes that climate change should be given new art forms, new literary forms, because the calamity of climate change does not fit traditional forms. His novel, The Hungry Tide, 2004, it is set in the Sundarbans, a labyrinthine mangrove delta in the Bay of Bengal. The hungry tide delves into the fragile balance between human communities and nature. So, this novel is very different from others, as all his novels are different. So, it deals about the struggles of these people who live in the Sundarbans deltas and in the mangroves, and their struggle for survival. And so, in many of his books, he brings the West and the East together. He places the characters from India in the abroad, in the American or the European worlds, tries to fit them there, or he brings back characters who are already uh, sort of used to that culture. Maybe they are Indian, or maybe they are themselves people who have never known India. They come to India, and so it is a kind of fiction that tries to bring the world together. It tries to bring various concerns together, and it's constantly traveling from India abroad, and then his characters are coming back to India also, their homecomings also. So, this story of The Hungry Tide also deals with an Indian American marine biologist by the name of Piali Roy, and who is traveling to the Sundarbans to study the endangered Irrawaddy dolphins. So, we can see the dolphins are also a species that is almost close to extinction, and this endangered species. So, he has dealt with this issue of the dolphins here. We can see the presence of the non human here, and so this novel focus specifically on some climate change issues. So this novel, it captures the intricate bonds between the local communities and their environment, depicting how natural disasters such as cyclones and flooding shape their lives. It also raises questions about displacement, as people are forced to migrate due to climate pressures and rising sea levels. So, the Sundarbans has been shown in his novel to be a kind of place which continuously sinks and rises. The people have learned to adapt to that. There is no permanence about the mangroves. They disappear and then they reappear. So he and then uh, in addition to the natural patterns, they are being threatened by climate change, loss of biodiversity, and the extreme climate events, and it's becoming harder and harder for them to cope with these events and to survive them. And many of them are displaced from their homes, and it is very hard on them economically, and they lose their homes. So there are many various causes that make them migrate, such as rising sea levels, or the and the subsequent submergence of their land, or, or the lack of or the shortage of biodiversity, where which supported them. They there is beekeeping that works from the Sundarbans. I was in Calcutta um, a year or so ago, and I was pleasantly surprised that there was honey that had come from the Sundarbans. So now the government too is trying to give these indigenous people jobs and sort of economic independence by you helping them sell forest products. Gun Island, 2019. So, in this novel, he deals with the topic of climate change through the lens of mythology, migration, and ancient folklore. This novel follows Datta, a rare books dealer from Brooklyn, who becomes fascinated by an old Bengali legend involving a mythical figure called Bonduki Sadaukar, or the gun merchant. So we can see the use of uh, mythology and folklore in this novel. And if we remember, in the previous week, we discussed folk tales and mythology, and we also paid attention to the fact that these myths and these folk tales are taken up by fiction, whether it's short fiction or it's novels. So Ghosh makes use of these myths and folk tales. Gun Island uses allegory to depict climate change, suggesting that today's environmental challenges are not only scientific and political issues, but are also deeply embedded in human history and suggested by mythology. So, as mentioned in earlier lessons, that when we look deeply at these myths and these folk tales, we find the suggestion of future disasters, and we also find a treasure house of wisdom on how to cope with climate impacts and how to live in synchronicity with the environment. So this novel, it uses allegory, it uses this myth of the Banduki Saudagar for his story and to further the cause of discussing climate issues and bringing them to public view. He has a unique perspective as an Indian writer on climate change. His work on climate change is deeply rooted in cultural and environmental diversity of India and the broader South Asian region. So that's why he is an important South Asian voice to talk about climate issues in South Asia, specifically India. Unlike many Western approaches to climate change, which focus on technological solutions and policy frameworks, Ghosh storytelling highlights the everyday realities of people in vulnerable regions who live at the forefront of the climate impact. So, where there are developed nations and where the writers talk about technology and policy frameworks, he talks about the daily lives of people who are in these vulnerable regions and they are facing the climate impact very deeply. So, as we also discussed in earlier lessons, that the climate change impact is not uniform. It's felt differently in different places. So, Amitav Ghosh is an important voice who uh, gives this information about how things are in India. Here he discusses the Irrawaddy dolphin. So, we have heard a lot about dolphins in different parts of the world, but very little is mentioned in books about the dolphins that are there in India. In fact, some of people may not even know that there are dolphins in India. So, when he touches on such issues, he becomes a voice for his country and for the South Asian region to talk about the uniqueness of the region, its cultural diversity, and its vulnerable points, how it is reeling under the climate impact. So he focuses a lot on the mangroves, that is there in several of his books. I also mentioned earlier that post colonial aspects are an important part of many of his works. Many of his stories are set into the post colonial context. For example, the novel The Glass Palace. We know that when the British colonies were formed, then Burma was also one colony, and the whole process of this colonizing of Burma is in this novel, The Glass Palace. And I would also mention that it talks about the raiding of the central symbol of the 1,000 years old Burmese culture, that is the glass palace, and the taking prisoner the royalty and then taking them to Ratnagiri in India and making them live like refugees or prisoners over there. And they had a grand uh, monarchy that was thousands of years old. But the mention is only of the human lives lost, of the human culture. There is very little mention in that book about the non human. So, the non human is also an important part, and he deals with it in other books. So, colonialism is an important part of his works. Um, Even in Shadow Lines, it's there. It's there in several other of his works. We have the Ibis trilogy. There also he talks about this issue of colonialism. Human and non-human interconnectedness. Ghosh's portrayal of the interdependence between human beings, animals, and ecosystems challenges the anthropocentric view that has traditionally dominated environmental discourse. So, when he talks about the interconnectedness of the environment and the relationship between humans, animals, and ecosystems in his works, uh, this challenges the anthropocentric work that is so much a part of environmental discourse, that human beings are at the center and nature is at their mercy, and human beings interpret what climate change is and how nature should be treated, but he wants to undo the Anthropocene. This perspective, rooted in Indian cultural philosophy, emphasizes the need for a more holistic approach to understanding ecological crisis. So, when he talks about decentering man, he talks about the importance of nature, which has not been there in earlier European literature, and he believes that the Indian cultural philosophy emphasizes a holistic approach to talk about human beings as part of the environment, not as separate and not as superior to the environment and to the non human. So, these things are important in understanding the ecological crisis in totality, and these are the very ideas that are espoused by Arnines, who was influenced by uh, Mahatma Gandhi, and also eco spirituality, which talks of ancient traditions. So Ghosh is not far off, even though he deals with post colonial worlds and modern issues. But the basic idea of interconnectedness is there in many other philosophies related to environmentalism and to related to climate change. The use of cultural narratives and myths in works like Gun Island, Ghosh uses myths to emphasize the historical continuity of climate events and their significance in cultural memory. This approach suggests that stories, traditions, and folklore are valuable tools for understanding and responding to environmental challenges, providing a way to communicate the impact of climate change across generations. So, through Gun Island, he points out the significance of the cultural history and how all these traditional stories and folklore can help to deal with environmental challenges. As said earlier, there are storehouse of wisdom on how to relate to the environment, how to deal with various climate issues, and also they communicate some ideas to future generations. And how to save the future generations. So there is a sacred element in all these myths, and Ghosh uses that sense of the sacred to talk about the importance of these native places, the importance of these indigenous places, and later on he has used the story and the legend of Bon Bibi also. So there are many other things. Here it was in Gun Island, it is Banduk Ki Saudagar, but in Hungry Tide it is Bon Bibi, and again in yet another novel, uh, Jungle Nama. Uh, Actually, it's not a novel, it's a thin book of poetry, and that too deals with this legend of Bon Bibi. So, there are other works too which deal with the idea of climate change, though not very directly. So, The Glass Palace 2000, The Sea of Poppies 2008, The Nutmeg's Curse, Parables for a Planet in Crisis. The Nutmeg's Curse is a recent novel, and this too traces the idea of climate change, which started with the nutmeg, which is a spice that is found in our kitchens, and one could not imagine that it has such a old and deep history, and it has such a deep connection to colonialism. So the amazing thing is that Amitav Ghosh's works are very well researched, and he uses factual information to create his fiction, and to tell about the state of climate impact, especially in the third world countries in South Asia. Let's go back to the great derangement once more, since it's such a key text. Ghosh contends in this work that contemporary literatures have neglected climate change as a subject, even though it is an issue that profoundly affects human lives and the planet's future. So, there has been a lot of neglect as far as this climate impact is concerned, and how it is gathering fierceness and strength over the last 200 or 300 years. So, literature by and large has not talked about it, except for the climate change literature that comes around the 1980s. He suggests that the literary world is in a state of derangement, marked by a failure to incorporate climate change into mainstream narratives. And this, according to Ghosh, is a dereliction of duty by writers who wield significant influence over public opinion and cultural values. So, there are many canonical writers today, but their works skip out on this idea of climate change, and he suggests that this is an issue that should be taken up more and more. So, as you can see that we discussed some novels of Amitav Ghosh, and his interest in anthropology, his interest in politics, his interest in history, his interest in climate change, all the things are brought about, and he's an avid researcher and perhaps a very curious and interested traveler, because they are in these early novels also he traveled different countries. The characters belong to the Middle East, or they may belong to America or UK or India, so Burma, so or Bangladesh. So though he never forgets his Bengali background, he very unself consciously uses that framework of reference very often, but he travels widely and he talks about a variety of locations in his work. So let us stop here in this lesson, and I hope I was able to communicate the brilliance of Amitav Ghosh's works in relation to climate change impacts. Thank you.